Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and I think you're in for a real treat today, especially if you're interested in the topics of consciousness and the human brain. To talk to us about those subjects today is the Thomas C. Brownell Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Program and Neuroscience at Trinity College, Dan Lloyd. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I think it's best to first start with a definition. How would you define consciousness?
Right. Well, you've asked the right first question because it's the one that kind of gets brushed over when people refer to consciousness. As far as definitions are concerned, what we're talking about is something big and complicated. And the philosophical discipline that goes after that is called phenomenology. And so one can list aspects of consciousness, but what I think is important is to be aware of the richness of the contents of our conscious minds, particular kind of richness, and most particularly it's a richness about our relationship to time. I think that's the element of our study or understanding of consciousness, which is sort of underappreciated. We don't see time, but we are aware of time. So it's different from other forms of perception in that way. So what is that? Our lives in time are spread out. They are not the life of a video camera, which is always instantaneous and sort of reflexively connected to the world around it. Our lives in time are aware of both the immediate past and future at all times. We're constantly monitoring ourselves because our present is not just that narrow point of the absolute now. Our present is something which reaches several seconds and beyond into the future, but also several seconds into the past as well. I couldn't finish making a sentence if I wasn't aware of how the sentence began. And it's that awareness spread out over time which gives consciousness its richness. The rest would be the things that people do talk about, like perception, awareness of the world around us, selective response to behavioral stimuli, stuff like that.
All right. What I want to do is go over a few areas of the brain and you tell us what they do. Obviously, if I wanted to cover every part of the brain, we'd be here till the cows came home. So I've limited to a select few that I think are important. If there's something else that you think is vital to the discussion, by all means, point it out. But I want to start with the amygdala. What is the amygdala?
All right.
And what
So
does it do?
what does it do? Amygdala is kind of a good one because actually there is a moderately detailed sense of what's going on in there. Amygdala is the thing that responds instantly to stimuli that might be threatening. So when you are walking down a path and you see a stick, but you think it might be a snake, that first reaction, you don't know what it is, that clunk, that's the amygdala. That's corrected. That first impression is like the alarm system. The fire alarm goes off from the amygdala. And then the cortex, that is everything else, jumps right in there and says, oh, no, I'm not sure that that's a snake, that's a stick, you're okay. But that's a slower reaction. The very, very fast reaction seems to be mediated by amygdala. That's one of its functions. People without amygdalas actually kind of lack that sort of fear or startle response. So that's one of the pieces of evidence that goes into it. But we could start there. Amygdala is the fire alarm.
Now, that is one of the ways in which it's determined which part of the brain does what, right? Because people get a part of the brain damaged in that it's examined. Well, what are they lacking now? Like
Right.
the famous case is Phineas Gage. I don't know what exactly, like an iron rod went through his head or something.
Yeah.
But that's how these things are partly how they're studied, correct?
Yeah.
Oh,
Phineas Gage was tamping dynamite into a hole. He was working on a excavation, and he set it off, and the rod just went right straight through him, and he survived and
oof.
became famous that way.
Became a real jerk too, didn't he?
Yes, that was part of what was lost. Is some of the areas that seem to monitor, and his self-control, his inhibitions went away, or were reduced at least.
Okay, what can you tell us about the little seahorse, the hippocampus?
Yeah, hippocampus is another one. Is in fact a very multi-purpose sort of part of the brain, and so in part seems to be involved in short-term memory. That is the memory of, like, say, the last 30 seconds of what's happened. Um, It also seems to be involved in spatial location and spatial navigation. And it seems that it is, in a certain way, the first way station for a memory before it gets encoded into the brain at large as a persistent and long-term memory. So if you interrupt that stage, you won't get the long-term memory. Um, so that seems to be part of its function. It's involved in lots of stuff, though. So that's true for all of these things. They're all there. It's like a committee meeting. People might have their like official role here. So and so is the secretary, and someone else is the treasurer, but they're all jumping all over each other all the time. It's like each one knows what the other one's job is and is going to have their own view on it. Anyway, it's hurting the cats.
So would working memory be hippocampus? Is that an area that would like when you mentioned the starting of a sentence and then you have to be aware that the end of the sentence is coming, but also when you get to the end of the sentence, you have to remember what you had already uttered. Would the
Mhm.
hippocampus play a role in that area?
Yes, well, it might. It's more like in the 30-second range. And here I'm thinking about someone you probably are thinking of too. HM, a famous patient actually who was operated on here in Hartford, Connecticut. Um, HM, to control severe epilepsy, had both of his hippocampi, both sides of his hippocampus removed. It was understood that you could control some severe epilepsy by removing part of the hippocampus. The surgeon who did it said, well, if you can remove half of it and it's okay, you can move both sides and it'll be okay. It wasn't okay. HM couldn't remember anything beyond about 30 seconds of life. In other words, his long-term memory stopped when he had the operation at the age of 18. He was unable to retain anything that happened. He could sort of be present for the immediate 30 seconds, but he would lose that information as soon as that time had passed. So the doctor would have to introduce herself every single time she went into his room. Um, and because he would forget every single time that that was going on. So hippocampus, that was the damage, and that seems to have had something to do with what he then couldn't do. However, he was still operating in that framework of time. He still could complete sentences. And so that sort of very short-term compacted awareness of past and future was preserved. And so that seems to represent to rest on a sort of more generic or a different mechanism than whatever's going on in the hippocampus.
All right. Now for the relay station, the thalamus.
Ah, yeah. Okay, great. Um, relay station is exactly right. And by the way, these are all sort of the received view. What happens to all received views is that 10 years pass and they are discovered to be very partial, if not wrong. And so we're in the received view territory here. The basic senses pass through the thalamus on their way to everywhere else. Vision goes through part of the thalamus, and this is where as it's on its way back to the visual cortex, and so does sound, so does hearing. Um, it seems to be a way station, and I believe it's implicated in emotional processing as well. I'm not totally sure about that. In any case, it's an absolute necessary condition for consciousness. If you don't have a thalamus, you are in a coma. Um, and so for whatever it's doing, it's essential that it keep doing it in order to be aware of the world. Um, yeah, and so that's kind of the relay station is sort of the starting point for that. That sounds about right.
So before I get to the next area, you hinted at something there that is important in that the received view is basically a localization view that each part of the brain does a specific thing. But that view has been waning, at
Right.
least as long as I've been looking into the issue, to
Yeah.
a more holistic view of the brain.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a good characterization of it. The debate goes way back between you've heard of Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. They disagreed, I think. In any case, that was the view, and it was based on the kinds of things we've been talking about. When a person has damage to a certain part of their brain, they lose a certain kind of part of their functionality. And so people say, oh, that part of the brain was involved in that functionality. But of course, all you know is that it's a necessary condition. If you pull the carburetor out of your car, it will stop running. But that doesn't mean the carburetor is the engine or the thing that's
Right.
actually doing the work. So right, that comes and goes, and in fact, waning. A couple of things have kind of pushed on the localization. Partly the empirical evidence is always edgy, which is to say, not only would HM say lose a particular function, but who knows what else? In other words, they ask only where they have a specific hypothesis. And then you come back 10 years later and say, well, wait, maybe there's something else going on. I could give you a kind of story, a little
Sure.
slightly extended example. The so-called default mode network, which has come on the scene really since around the year 2000. Um, when we're not doing anything else, there's a particular network in the brain which is active. And so it's so-called default mode. It's the coasting or the idling brain. Um, the default mode's always there, but the experiments that people were conducting wouldn't have seen it. It was just a question of, in a sense, changing or flipping the narrative a little bit. Instead of asking what's going on in the brain when it's doing something on the assumption that it's not doing anything at all in the in-between, if you ask what's going on in the brain in the in-between when it's not involved in some task, and if you look positively for that, you find this network, and it's kind of there all the time. It involves a variety of brain regions. And then the question is, well, what's that doing? The takeaway of the moral of the story, though, is that it was there, but it took someone to actually flip the question that they're asking in order to say, well, is there something there in the in-between that we always thought was nothing? And as soon as they asked that question, they found something. So that kind of empirical revelation is always possible, and that's sort of part of the fun of this. But the other thing is that the awareness that the kind of computer we might be talking about here, when we think of it as something more like a brain, that would be a neural network. What we find is that specialist functions or localized functions actually don't seem to be spontaneously arising when we have a simulated artificial neural network. Instead, information gets distributed in a complex pattern which is sort of shared. It's as if we represent something instead of with a single pixel with a bunch of pixels that are varying together, but the whole thing adds up to a distributed picture of information. And so it's more distributed around the brain. That would be the takeaway, which means that function is also going to be more distributed. It's going to be messier than we might like.
Okay, so now that we've debunked the localization theory, I'm going to ask you to go back to it and tell us what the reticular activating system is and does.
You know what? It's out. You're now out of my wheelhouse.
Oh, okay.
You tell
Sorry.
me.
All I know,
Remind me a bit.
it's just when I think of it, what I can remember about it is it's basically it regulates what we pay attention to.
Okay.
So if I'm in a room and I'm reading and people are talking, I can kind of focus on what I'm reading.
Mhm.
But if somebody were to say Mike, that would, catch my
Right.
attention because that's my name. And I think that that's where the reticular activating
All
system
right. So I can't talk about the
acts.
brain parts of that, but I do know the experimental protocols. The two kinds of attention. One is our internal attention, where we're focused on something. And the other is where our attention is grabbed from outside, just like the example that you just gave. And so our ability to direct our attention is a really interesting capacity that we have. I can be staring right at a point in front of me, but can comment on things in my peripheral vision. And in fact, I can keep my attention while I'm still looking at the point in front of me. I can have my attention, I can be paying attention to a zone apart from where I'm focused, but I can move that attention around, which is kind of interesting because it changes how fast I can respond to things in the periphery, according to what I'm kind of, in a sense, primed to do. So that's a little bit about how attention works. The parts of the system, I have no opinion on.
Well, I'll bet you're going to know about the next area I'm going to ask
Uh-oh.
about the prefrontal cortex.
Yep. Yeah, that's what we go to grad school to acquire. So it a lot of stuff's going on there. Of course, that they talk, the received view is planning, deliberation, um, higher level, we might say cognition, being able to interpret more complex patterns. And that too is directing, as when we talk about the focus of attention, all these areas of the brain, in a sense, can send their searchlights where they need to, according to their own modes of operation. Prefrontal cortex it seems to be kind of executive in the sense that is not exactly in control, but if you have damage to your prefrontal cortex, your ability to do anything that's sort of sustained, planning involved, complex, all of that is greatly diminished. And so in that sense, it's this hugely, first of all, it's huge. I mean, in the sense that it's one of the larger areas that we've been talking about, but also it's involved in everything. And of course, like everything else, complex, which means only partly understood.
Now, as we've kind of hinted at, or maybe even said explicitly, consciousness doesn't reside in one part of the brain. It's a function or a result of an interaction of many parts that, that are interconnected. Can you explain a little bit about how these interactions take place and the role that neurotransmitters play in them?
Okay, right. So this is 3% of our body weight, the brain, that is. But 20% of our metabolic action. In other words, the brain runs hot, it runs very hot, and it runs hot all the time. It runs hot in sleep and dreaming, and of course, it runs hot in waking life. There's a whole lot going on at all times. So what we have are in the neighborhood of 100 billion neurons, which is about as many as there are stars in the galaxy. They're interconnected, however, and each one of them can be connected to hundreds of other neurons, in some cases, thousands of other neurons. And those connections are not right next door to each other. Axons, the sort of tiny little fibers that are sort of output lines from neurons, can be inches long. They can even be longer than that. And so just think about the spaghetti that we're talking about here. It's vast. Now, neurotransmitters then are modulating each and every one of those connections. Some of the neurotransmitters are, as it were, really are modulators. They're like sprinkler systems that can either raise or lower the overall activity of the system. But in any case, between every single neuron, there's the little gap called the synapse. And what mediates the transmission of information across the synapse is the neurotransmitter. Those are the neurotransmitters. So that's the basic chemical pathways of the brain. So what's going on then is you can imagine a very complex. I mean, I'm visualizing right now as if the galaxy is a fireworks display. I mean, it's going off all over the place all the time, and that something happening in one place is affecting something that's happening somewhere else. In a general way, you can think about waves of activation. And I mention this because now we could talk a bit about brain waves, that is the EEG or electroencephalograph, recording of small electrical potentials on the scalp. And our brains seem to produce different kinds of rhythms. And, alpha and gamma and theta are examples of that. One of those rhythms, the last one, gamma, operates at about 40 hertz, 40 cycles per second. And what that cycle seems to be is from the back of the brain, or we might call the sensory periphery, towards the front and back again. And so it's like swoop, boom, 40 times a second. So I always think it's kind of interesting to think of ourselves flickering in that way, because the first part of that flicker is sensory processing. Information's coming in. That's getting sent to the more so-called reflective parts, which are then interpreting and then redirecting, we might say, attention in different ways back to the starting point. One way to think about the global operation of all of this is something like that. It's passing back and forth among all these different regions that we've been talking about. So region says it's this, and something up there says, what if it's that? Or says this, and then it says, so, oh, go look for that, or this, no, you're wrong. These are all the different things that could come from above, as it were, back to the sensory peripheries to adjust their input. But they, are going to say that back to the front. So that's going to cycle back and forth. They get information from the front. They then compare that to what's coming in the world. Then they send that forward, and the front says, okay, now let's combine this with this new information. It goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this is happening very rapidly all the time. That's one possible way of thinking about all this. You could think about little clouds of light like fireflies. I mean, there's at this point, things kind of lapse into metaphor.
Now, we have a lot of electricity going on in the brain.
Yeah.
Now, but in the neurotransmitters are no different, except for that in order to cross the synapse, they've got to change, right, into fluid. What is that? How does that explained?
Right. It's electrochemical. So there's a little bit of both. The thing that's most like electricity is the transmission of the signal down the axon. That's still a chemical process, but it's mediated by charged ions. And so in that sense, it's like electricity. That electrochemical signal travels down the length of the axon and hits the synapse. When it hits the synapse, there are tiny little vesicles, there are tiny little pockets of neurotransmitter that are sitting at the upstream side. The incoming signal, boom, releases those. They dump into the synapse. And then on the other side of the synapse, on the receiving cell, those neurotransmitters lock on to the cell membrane and cause a pore to open so that this flow of ions can now start in the next neuron, and that cascade of ionic action then goes up. So the actual neurotransmitter piece is, I think, strictly chemical. It's across this incredibly tiny little space. It's very small, and so it can happen fast, and that's why at one time they thought it was instantaneous, but measuring the absolute speed of neural conduction, it's fast without being infinite. So it's that tiny little chemical dropper that's happening right at the end or wherever the synapses are.
Okay, now I'm going to get
sort of about right. Yeah.
For some philosophical stuff. Now, when you talk about the prefrontal cortex, it's the seat of executive functioning. It's what allows us to see into the future, not in a Nostradamus way, but in a way to see the consequences of our actions. Right. So it's in many ways the seat of moral responsibility.
Right.
Now, the brain is a physical system. And given that consciousness is dependent on the brain, many, if not most, philosophers and neurologists or neuroscientists think that what is commonly called free will is a myth, that it's just an epiphenomenon of consciousness that makes us think that we're making choices when in reality we're completely determined systems. I don't adhere to that view, but I'm just interested to get your take as a neuroscientist and a philosopher on whether the evidence supports the conclusion that we're determined systems, and what implication does that have for the view of humans as responsible agents.
Yeah, and it is the question. If you're teaching in this area, you won't get too far into the course before it comes up, and it is a philosophical question. But now, of course, the brain seems again and again to be deterministic, and that is what we'd expect. So I'll mention, the view that I would endorse, I think, is called compatibilism. And it's the view that, on the one hand, everything is determined. On the other hand, what it means to be free is to be able to act on our own reasons, to own our own cognitive life, as opposed to being able to do absolutely anything at any moment. Um, the idea of an absolute free will would be something that doesn't have a material cause. So it's not clear what that could even be. And it does sound like it's sort of random, which is not what we want from free will. We don't want to be uncaused. We don't want to just do anything that happens. We want to act according to our own reasons. We want to be the ones who decide. We want our decisions to be the decisions that cause the action or that we're enabled to do that. We're unfree if we're coerced, drugged, drunk. All of these things reduce this ability to act for our own selves, on our own reasons. So that could still be fully caused and even deterministically caused, but we can still care about it, and it still is what we want because that's when we say, well, I was free to do this and I did it, means that I wanted to do it, and that means that there were reasons that I had for doing it. That's what I'm looking for, and that's compatible with the idea that that all those are physical processes that are causal and deterministic. So that's why it's called compatibilism. Those two things can live together, and in fact, you get everything you want from the idea of free will you can have within the compatibilist framework. I'll mention one of my mentors, Daniel Dennett.
I knew he was going to come up.
Yeah, I had to. I mean, he would come up in any case, but he's also an important influence and a great read. The book that I like best on this very topic is called Elbow Room, and the subtitle is The Types of Free Will Worth Wanting. And I recommend it because he goes through all of the different ways we think about, I was free to do that, I was not free to do this, and interprets them, manages and pulls them out within this overall compatibilist framework. And so that's the general idea, that you can both be fully causally determined and yet the owner of your own life, and that's what we look for in free will.
See, my view of free will, first of all, like through introspection, I can see the difference between making an effort and not making an effort. Between having a desire to do something and refraining from doing it or doing it. And all this certainly seems to me as if I have some control over it, not over every thought that comes into my head or every desire that I face, but I do have a control over effort. I also know the difference between when somebody picks me up and carries me, or if without my consent, or if I just walk. So there seems to be a difference there, but there's also sort of a linguistic problem. I don't want to call, I don't know if that's the right terminology, but I don't have a better one for it on the fly here. But whenever confronted with determinist arguments, or when I'm discussing this with determinists, they say things like, we're all determined, therefore we should. And I remember reading Beyond Freedom and Dignity years ago by B.F. Skinner, and he talked about his whole idea is that human behavior is determined, but then he had a series of recommendations. And they never seem to be able to get away from that, or the fact that if my brain is 100% determined and my consciousness is 100% determined, then the amount of effort I'm going to put into investigating any issue and the very conclusions I'm going to come to are completely determined, as are theirs. And it's just, it gets into not making any sense,
right?
Because you're trying to convince me of something that I have no control over. You have no control over it. And I mean, it just will make the mind explode to think of all the ways in which it ends up being contradictory.
Well, nowadays there are many ways for our minds to explode.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, it is. All of the things you were saying is that I can tell when I'm making an effort. I choose to make an effort, but it's that choice. I mean, well, your metaphor was actually the nice one, is I know the difference between walking out the door and being carried out the door. Now, that difference is clearly, I mean, think of all the ways in which those two states are different. The walking out the door might still be determined, but the thing is, you're doing it. And when I say I'm making the effort, you are making the effort. But that's another one of your actions, another one of your choices to make the effort. And that can be determined. And yet effortness and effortless and or laziness, that's still going to happen. Sometimes you're going to be in one of those days, and some days you're going to be one of those energized and you know, energetic sorts of days. Um, Once again, it's not that there is a me standing back from all of this and watching all this deterministic action going on and saying, oh, look, I can't do anything about it. The doing of something about it is all the deterministic action at the same time. You are, and of course, the thinking about what you're doing is part of that flow as well. In a way, it kind of goes back to this cyclical forward to and fro that I was describing earlier. We feel things, nothing is that it happens to us. We judge what we're doing and appraise it, decide whether to continue or not. That decision, whether to continue or not, also falls under the umbrella of a causal process. We make that decision. I'm happy with that decision because I look at the decision and I can see that it was the right move to make. And all of this, as long as no one is forcing me or nothing is forcing me, I am in charge there. Once again, the I is not this thing that's looking down on this causal action and being either tied to it, constrained by it, limited by it. The I is that causal interaction. It's all of that stuff. And when I say I'm referring to a whole package of potentialities and memories and everything else that goes into it. I can have ownership. I can be completely in charge of all of that. And in that sense, feel completely free because all of that is me and is not being forced from outside. I mean, we talk about genetic and all that other stuff, but the immediate trajectory of the action I'm about to take, whatever that will be, is something that rests on everything that I am, plus my environmental conditions. But if I'm free, those environmental conditions are not constraining me. They're telling me what's possible, but they're not telling me what I have to do most of the time. If they were, that would be coercion, and that would be unfree. So again, I'm just trying to articulate how one thinks about these things, thinking about an incredibly diffuse, highly distributed, fast, incredibly complex organ that's taking care of everything for us. How to think about what's going on in that with respect to ourselves, which historically, we refer to the I as a sort of punctate gem. Descartes thought the interface was at the pineal gland. That's talk about localization.
Well, hold on 1 second. He thought that the interface was of the I don't know how to pronounce it. Pineal
The
gland.
pineal gland. Yeah, yeah.
Was like our connection to God, right?
That's right. He thought our connection to our immortal soul, our immaterial mind, he couldn't figure out where that could happen, and in his philosophy, it had to happen somewhere. And the pineal happens to be the one of the few single glands. Most of the parts of us are in two parts and are double. The pineal sits right in the middle of the brain, and there's just one of them. And he could not figure out what it was for. And in fact, I think it's a pretty open question still. So he thought, well, that's the switchboard. That's where the soul actually manages to communicate all of its signals to the brain, because it's got to do that. We can't move without some material energy entering into the system. And that was going to happen at the pineal. But that reflects the view that there is a very strict or exact I that is somehow separate from all this action that we're talking about. And that, I think, has also eroded, and I think rightly so, as we think more and more about, I don't know, ourselves as histories, as narratives, as a set of intentions and a whole bag of stuff, which is going on in us all the time.
Okay, my last question, it's a little it involves the brain, but it also involves an area that's important to me personally, and that
Yeah.
is there's a big debate in criminal justice about what responsibility juveniles should have for their actions. And
Yeah.
the argument is that the human brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, the areas responsible for executive decision making and foresight, is not completely developed until we're 25. So the
Right.
argument goes, if somebody under 25 commits a crime, that person should not be held accountable. Now, I'm going to tell you my view, and then I'll get your feedback. It
Hmm.
is true that the brain is not completely developed until we're 25. That doesn't mean that it's completely undeveloped until we're 25.
Hmm. Hmm.
In other words, the moral culpability of a 16-year-old is different from that of a 9-year-old, and the
Hmm.
moral culpability of a
Hmm.
30-year-old
Hmm.
is different from a 16-year-old.
Hmm.
Now, so if an 18-year-old commits a crime, yes, it's true he's not at the state of a 25-year-old, but he does have a culpability.
Hmm.
My personal view, and it doesn't originate with me, I read it somewhere, I don't remember where, so I can't give the appropriate credit, is that the problem is in the juvenile or in the criminal justice system in having two categories. You're either a child or you're an adult, when really there should be a third category for maybe adolescent or young adult that is fit in there. That's how I think of it, but I'm interested to see what you think about it.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you. Um,
Well, good. You're a very smart guy then.
yeah, I guess so. Um, that absolutely 18-year-olds can do bad things and be responsible for it. I think that in a way, I think you're right. The absolute distinction when a 17-year-old is sentenced to life without parole, that strikes me as cruel and unusual. Um,
Sure.
and now certain state legislatures like that idea, where they want to stick it to them somehow. If you've done something wrong, you got to pay and pay. The problem is that eliminates any possibility of reform, reentry into society. The other side of being 18 and doing something wrong is it's not too late to change your character, um, to learn from that mistake, and to enter an adult life that's absolutely reasonable and just life. And so that I think the takeaway on the developing brain is not so much, well, it is a reduction in responsibility in the sense that we're not going to hold them as punishable as we would if the crime's committed by a 30-year-old. Um, so it's not so much we're changing our sense of responsibility, but we are changing what we think will be effective in response. In particular, I mean, the penal system is a mess for lots of reasons, but in part, the loss of the idea of reflection, moral growth, and reform, and being prepared to re-enter society, that's been lost in the idea of punishment. The idea that we have to get our revenge and all we can do is by inflicting pain. That just creates a societal cycle as well as an individual cycle of recidivism. So that's my way of elaborately agreeing with what you're saying. So
Yeah.
yeah,
See,
I think it's based, the brain absolutely supports that view. I think everything that we know in neuroscience is right on target with that.
in Connecticut, where I am, and I think you are as well,
Hmm.
I had a once a lengthy correspondence with the guy who at the time was the senior juvenile prosecutor in the state, and he had been so
Hmm.
for 30 years or so. And his concern was that they had changed the age of what it means to be a juvenile to 18. So you were a juvenile up until you were 18. And the
Hmm.
thing was, is if you were charged as a juvenile, the maximum sentence that you could get, I believe, is 30 months with a possibility of elevating it to 36, or it might have been 24 to 30. I don't remember exactly,
Hmm.
but it wasn't very long. So in other words, if you were a juvenile and you killed somebody and they kept you in juvenile court, you would only be able to serve 30 months. So the push then is to charge them as adults, in which case now they're exposed to life in prison. And
Hmm.
that just seemed like so absurd to me that your alternatives are a couple years or throw you away,
Right.
where there's so much middle ground there.
Hmm.
But when people, if I'm given the choice and I see this 17-year-old has committed a horrific crime, and my choice is, well, let's just let him go in a couple years, let him
Hmm.
do a few months or whatever, or lock him up forever. I'm going to say, well, justice and the protection of society demands that he be put away for the longer period.
Hmm. Hmm.
But that's very unpalatable to me. And I don't know what you know about me, but when I was 21 years old, I was sentenced to 33 years in prison. And
Hmm.
the judge looked at me and basically said I was an irredeemable human being.
Hmm.
I was done. There was nothing that could happen. And that was, in looking back, it's ridiculous that he thought that. I mean, I ultimately served
Hmm.
25 years in Connecticut prisons,
Geez. Okay.
but and I was guilty and I deserved to be punished, but I wasn't irredeemable like the judge thought.
Hmm. Oh, absolutely.
And there's so
Nobody
many people that
irredeemable.
applies
Right.
to.
Right. Totally. I mean, first of all, uh, how to express solidarity and testimonial, this is a life experience that you endured, which is fantastic, but was unjust. It was unfair. So just to bear witness to that,
Well,
um,
thank you.
I think is a true assessment. As it happens, my wife, who is also an academic, teaches at the Cheshire prison,
Oh, wow.
and she teaches college courses there. And so if she were on this podcast, and she might be a target for a future, um, would absolutely support with stories. And in fact, I know many of her guys, her former students, who will do some of them. I mean, in fact, the committing a crime at a young age is actually very much the kind of thing that has locked up a lot of her students for 20 years at a time. Um, and so the assumption that they're incorrigible is, of course, I think that's wrong at any age. And I think that the first question of a penal system should be, well, there's a couple questions. First one should be, how can we get this person out of the crime business entirely for the rest of their lives? That's what we want. We don't want them off the street because it costs way more to keep them off the street than, say, to send them to Harvard. And so, it, but we want them not to go back into whatever bad stuff they were into when they're out there. That's one thing. But the other is the idea of justice itself. Um, there's a notion of there's retributive justice. You do something wrong and you have to pay. Um, and then there's restorative justice, which is you do something wrong and you have to make it right. You have to get in there somehow and and acknowledge, first of all, the wrong, but also take steps to remedy that. I would say, not to, I don't know much about your backstory, but you're the example of that, of coming back and giving. Um, and whatever the balance that was set, um, was disrupted in that bad moment way back when, you're pushing it in the other direction. You're making the world a better place. And I think that's possible. All of my wife's students, her former students, are absolutely there. They come out and not only are able to be productive citizens, but they get involved. They're political in the sense that they understand that that there's reform needed, that the guys who are coming out with them need an enormous amount of help and support. This is all human, and I think humane as well. So, so I think, yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with you, and it'd be hard for me to imagine some kind of table pounding person who would say, no, the 17-year-olds. I mean, say that with a straight face. The 17-year-old should be locked up for the rest of his life. What? I mean, you gotta be locked into some kind of weird, aggressive view, I think, to be happy about that, and to be able to stand at a podium and defend that. Now, having said that, there are victims, and the victims have an opinion on this matter as well. And in fact, one of the tasks the restorative justice initiative faces is to reach out to get to the victims to understand that there is something other than retribution possible here. But that involves, that is a total effort of openness that is hard to achieve. So,
I've actually fit into a space which has been uncomfortable for years because virtually nobody agrees with me.
Hmm.
when it comes to, because I actually agree with the stated goals of correction:
Yeah.
incapacitation, punishment, deterrence, rehabilitation.
Yeah.
The problem I have is that the correctional system does nothing ultimately but incapacitates. And I know people say, well, being incapacitated is punishment. But when I'm talking about punishment, I mean effective punishment in the sense of deterring bad behavior and
Hmm.
creating a disincentive for it so that you inspire the rehabilitation efforts. And for my 25 years in prison, it does very little of anything,
Hmm.
because the guys who want to change are the guys who are deterred from changing, whereas guys who just want to sit around and play cards and engage in the same conduct that they were previously engaging in are basically allowed to do it. And my best friend is incarcerated in Cheshire, and he and I actually wrote a book called Down the Rabbit Hole: How the Culture of
Hmm.
Corrections Encourages
Yeah.
Crime.
Yeah.
And it was what we demonstrated was in large part that the staff and the inmates are on the same side in preserving the status quo, because
Hmm.
the status quo allows the
Hmm.
correctional employees to continue to get paid for doing virtually nothing. And it also allows the inmates to continue in a comfortable lifestyle of watching TV, playing
Yeah.
video games,
Hmm.
and gambling. And it was an interesting experience to be inside the prison and
Yeah.
have everybody angry at us, the inmates and the staff.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
oh,
That's fascinating. I'm going to look for the book, and I actually am going to have a chat with my wife about this too. She's a historian, and she's taught
oh,
courses
really?
on American history in Cheshire. So you probably know some of the same folks. Some of her guys are on the
Yeah,
inside, but some are out
yeah,
as well.
yeah.
Uh,
A little bit far afield from what we're talking about, but I don't. You're in Connecticut, you may know there's a big controversy about the sentence commutations.
hmm.
And I actually testified before the Judiciary Committee, and once again managed to piss everybody off, because what I said was I'm a big fan of giving people a break. I got a break myself
Hmm.
in terms of a sentence modification. The problem I have with the commutations is that there's no criteria for them. Nobody knows how to get them. And often what happens is, and there's also no means to keep track of who's actually reformed and who's not, because the
Hmm.
programs are a
Hmm.
joke.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you often end up with guys that deserve a break not getting it, and guys
Hmm.
that don't getting
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And that is a palpable injustice to me. So what I said was they should put them on hold until they figure out how
Hmm.
to do them justly. And of course, everybody got mad at me. The inmates got mad at me. The former inmates
Hmm.
got mad at me. The staff got mad at me as usual. But I don't really care, because I care about what is right.
Yeah. Getting it
And
right.
yes, and that is most important to me.
Yeah.
But I've now taken us way far from our original discussion, which is okay too.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. I
so
go ahead.
no, I was just gonna. You could say what you want to say, because I'm just gonna close up and ask people where they can find you. So if you had something you wanted to say, by all means.
Well, yeah. I just wanted to say that any neuroscientist in the world is going to agree with you. I think that it just doesn't make sense to have that sharp line at age 17 or at any age. Um, and so and getting it right, well, that is the issue of all bureaucracies, right? You know, it's like we try to write laws to make a society where injustice no longer happens. Um, but but the devil's in the details, and especially when you set up something and then 2 years later cut the funding for it and say you have to keep doing it anyway. That sort of thinking, nickel and diming, we call it, um, destroys successful programs. You know, if you're doing really great, so I bet you can do it with less money, is exactly the wrong path to take with some of these things. So anyway,
I'm going to
full
tell you,
speed ahead. Yeah.
I would love to talk to you about that, because I differ slightly with you, but I don't want
Okay.
it, it'll take us too far. But I will say
Okay.
this. An interesting thing that's happened to me since I've been out of prison is, in prison, the two thinkers, or maybe three, that inspired me most were a criminal psychologist named Stanton Saminow, the objectivist philosopher Ayn Rand, who I'm
Hmm.
sure you probably have a lot of disagreements with, which
Hmm.
is fine, and the sort of cognitive behavioral therapy, and plus a lot of economists.
Hmm.
Now, studying these things in prison, you're not where it was independent study, so we're not getting graded. So
Hmm.
ultimately, whether I'm learning or not, and understanding these things accurately, is difficult to assess. I
Hmm.
certainly thought I was, and so did my good friend Brent McCall, who is still in Cheshire. But when we wrote our book Down the Rabbit Hole, we based our theory of corrections in large part on Stanton Samanow and Samuel Yochelsson's theory of the criminal mind. They wrote a book.
Hmm.
They had a
Hmm.
3 volume set called The Criminal Personality, and then Stanton
Wow.
Samanow wrote his book Inside the Criminal Mind.
Hmm.
And one of the most rewarding things that I got was Stanton Samanow actually wrote a review of our book in Psychology Today. He
Hmm.
also mentioned us in his the last revised edition of Inside the Criminal Mind before he died. He referenced
Hmm.
us. And in a private email, he said to a friend of mine, these guys explained Samanow Yochelson better than Samanow Yochelson. So it was such great confirmation
Yeah.
in getting out and being able to interview on this podcast objectivist philosophers who say yes, you get it, you understand, and psychologists and economists as well. It's a very rewarding experience
Hmm.
because I'm interviewing people that I've been reading for,
Hmm. Hmm.
for
Hmm.
decades, and
Yeah.
now I'm looking at them and communicating with them. It's just a very
That's
very
fun.
rewarding experience. I just thought I'd share it with you. I don't know what
Well, yeah, I think
relevance it
that,
has, but hey, what the
yeah,
hell?
no, that's great. You know, Aristotle said that humans love to learn, and I think that's probably right. And I do think the meaning of life is partly at least involves that. If you're not in a situation where you can learn, that's terrible. And so you and people can do that. Well, it's harder in some context. You in prison learned. You were able to keep learning, and you desired to do that, and that's and here you are now. In any case, full speed ahead. I admire what you're
Thank you
telling me
so much.
about this backstory,
And
and
thank you so much for
yeah,
being here today. And where can people find you?
well, I think the easiest way is probably to Google me at Trinity College. So Dan Lloyd, Trinity College will take you to various sources. Emails is fine if people would like to contact me, and that's dan.lloyd at Trincoll, which is one word, TRINCOLL .edu. And so if your listeners, yeah, I'd be happy to follow up. As far as objectivism is concerned, yes, we have another conversation to have there at any time. So
Okay, beautiful.
yeah,
That might be more of a debate, which I'm okay with.
I think it
Well,
probably would be.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
when I have people on the show to debate, I just like to tell them ahead of time that it's going to be a debate because I don't like to blindside people and
Yeah.
well, I disagree with you and what do you think about this? So when it's going to be a debate, we establish ahead of time, okay, we're going to have a debate. I've had debates with many, I don't know about many, but numerous
Yeah.
professors,
Hmm. Hmm.
both objectivist professors, critics of objectivist, left-wing professors, right-wing professors. So
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
a good time. But I would love to have you on to do that, Professor. And thank you so much again for
Yeah.
taking your
Thank
time
you,
to
Michael.
be
This has
here.
been really good. Yeah. Good luck to you.
Thank you. And for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.